He really doesn't need any introduction, but for those of you who don't know, this man is an award-winning journalist, national security correspondent for the Nation magazine, and he has won some of journalism's highest awards, like the George Polk Award twice in 1998 and 2008. This year he was named one of 9 recipients of the Donald Wyndham Sandy M. Campbell Literature Prizes at Yale University. He is a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute and a regular guest on news shows like The Rachel Maddow Show, Real Time with Bill Maher, and of course, our favorite Democracy Now! Mainstream media calls on him often. He has been on ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, The News Hour, and Bill Moyer's Journal. He has reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, the former Yugoslavia, and elsewhere around the world. This man's reporting has sparked several congressional hearings. He is the author of the international bestseller, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, and his latest book, Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield, is also a documentary that won Best Cinematography at Sundance this year. Let's give a warm Bay Area welcome to a native son of the left and an exceptional young man. Give it up for Jeremy Scahill.
Embarrassed and honored at the same time. It's really great to be back at KPFA. I started off my life in journalism by stalking Amy Goodman. Some of you may know this story, but it's a totally true story. I was living and working in this homeless shelter in Washington, D.C. I'd never taken a journalism class in my life. And I was listening to a lot of talk radio at the time, and I heard this woman on the air, and she was talking about these rebels in the Congo fighting to overthrow the U.S.-backed dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko. And they aired this interview with Laurent Kabila, and I had never heard of any of this before, and I started listening to this station, and I'm hearing every day these reports about events that I was not familiar with, countries I had never heard of, and I became obsessed with, who is this person? I found out it's Amy Goodman and heard this incredible style of journalism that I'd never been exposed to. And I started to write her letters saying, if you have a dog, I'll walk your dog. That's your windows. I just wanted to be a part of it. And eventually I was living in New York, and I started going to events where Amy Goodman was speaking, and I would be the kid who would come up at the end of the line and just say, it would be possible to help out on your show or do anything. And I think eventually, I harassed her so much, not in a creepy way, I assure you, but where she had to decide whether she wanted to get a restraining order against me or let me come in and volunteer. So Amy agreed to let me come in and volunteer, and I went in there that first day at the radio station WBAI in New York. And at the time, it was on the 35th floor of 505 8th Avenue, right across the street from Madison Square Garden, and I went into the station, and there was a guy started sleeping at the front desk, and there were people sleeping on the floor at BAI. And there was let's just say there were some smells in there. Some of the people in this room may like. So I went into the station, and I had never been in a radio station before in my life, and so I went, and I didn't want to wake the guy at the front desk, but I had to, and I said, I would wake him up, wake Fred up. And I said, I'm here to see Amy. And he goes, who? And I said, Amy Goodman. And he goes, I don't know where she is. And so I just sort of left to wander through the station, and I see Amy tearing out, they were in fundraising, of course, Pacific is always in fundraising. She's tearing out of this room, and she's carrying these reel-to-reel tapes, and she's got newspapers falling all over, and she's got headphones kind of hanging off her. And she's like, oh, right, the volunteer. And she takes me to what looks like I thought that the entire station was Democracy Now! It was just Amy and one other person at the time. I didn't know that. So she takes me to what I think is like a broom closet, basically. It has no windows, it's just this little closet nestled in the center of the station. And there's just newspapers stacked up everywhere, and there's like a dot matrix printer and something vaguely resembling a computer. And she says, just go through all of the newspapers and clip every article about Iraq. And at the time, the Clinton administration was gearing up to bomb Iraq. And so I go through it, and 1 hour passes, 2 hours, 5 hours pass, and then Amy comes into the room, and she kind of sits down, and I said, well, you know, where's your office? And she goes, you're in it. And you know, I still to this day list, you know, on all sorts of things. I list Democracy Now! As my university, and I very much view Pacifica and Amy Goodman at Democracy Now! As my university, as my teachers, as my mentors. And so, you know, it's always special to come back, and I just want to say thank you to KPFA for blazing the trail and starting the Pacifica radio movement. Thank you to the staff and the volunteers at KPFA, and to Bob and Ken and Sabrina for working on this event and organizing it and making it possible. You know, we're living in a moment right now where we have a popular Democratic president who is a constitutional lawyer by trade, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. I didn't realize that was a laugh line. And this constitutional law professor, Nobel Peace Prize winning, popular Democratic president has, for all practical purposes, expanded or continued or intensified some of the most egregious aspects of what was called the Bush-Cheney counterterrorism program or national security program. You know, if you look at what's happening around the world and what's happened over the past 5 years, there's been an intensification of drone strikes, not just in Pakistan, but extending into Yemen and elsewhere. The U.S. is increasing its military presence on the African continent, targeting not only Somalia, but also Mali and Mauritania and elsewhere. There's now a full AFRICOM command, which is a combatant command that has jurisdiction of the U.S. military all throughout Africa. You have bombings that are happening regularly in Yemen, and you have a secret drone base that's not secret anymore that's been built in Saudi Arabia. The U.S. also has a military base in Djibouti called Camp Lemonnier, which is a former French military base. And you have an intensification of the covert wars, of the wars that are very reminiscent of a different era in time, the dirty wars in Central America, where the U.S. was funding the Contra death squads in Nicaragua and arming them, supporting reigning military juntas and murderous death squads like Battalion 316 in Honduras. I call the book Dirty Wars not to be a master of the obvious, not to say, oh, you know, there's no such thing as a clean war, but as a pushback against the notion that I think has been sold to particularly a lot of liberals in this country that drone strikes represent a smarter way of waging war, or that it's a clean way of waging war. But also because as I look and see all of this unfolding, I think we're returning to a time where we have a full spectrum of covert U.S. military power and CIA power being unleashed in an increasing number of countries. And it reminds me of what we saw happen in the 70s and 80s in Central and Latin America, and what we saw the CIA doing in Africa as people fought against colonialism and rose up. And we're living in this moment right now where I think if John McCain had won the election in 2008, a lot of liberals would be singing a very different tune about the same policies that they're cheerleading. I don't think that you would see polls indicating that 70% of self-identified liberals support drone strikes, or that the numbers drop only slightly when the target in question is a U.S. citizen. I think you hear a lot of liberals calling for impeachment of a President McCain if he had ordered operations that resulted in the killing of 3 U.S. citizens who had not been charged with a crime. But I think one of the enduring legacies of the Obama administration on a foreign policy level is going to be that he normalized assassination as a central component of what they call U.S. national security policy. And if you think about it, it's chilling. You know, I imagine, you know, I do think of Dick Cheney as this sort of cartoonish Darth Vader character who sits in his lair plotting the destruction of the world for the benefit of Halliburton stock, you know. But he must be fly fishing somewhere thinking, you know, I'm quite glad that Barack Obama's president, because a lot of this stuff would have been confronted by the very people who were in the streets when Bush and Cheney were running the show. And now it's been normalized and legitimized, and they're attempting to legalize it. And they're coming up with terms like the disposition matrix, which is like an algorithm that they're developing to determine who should die and who we might be able to capture. And they have meetings on Tuesdays, the Terror Tuesday meetings, where they go through rosters of people and propose new candidates for the kill list, and they make baseball cards, and then the president is presented with the baseball cards and decides who stays on the list, who leaves the list. These are systems that are being built by a popular Democratic president, and don't think for a moment that if a Jeb Bush or a Marco Rubio or whoever the Republicans put forward in these elections, if they win that office, they're not going to walk in there and say, I'm so glad that Obama laid the groundwork for us, because the liberals won't have a leg to stand on criticizing us when we do it. I think we really crossed a very serious line in late 2011 when President Obama authorized these strikes in Yemen that killed 3 U.S. citizens. I want to preface everything else I'm going to say tonight by saying that I don't believe that there should be any difference in how we view the value of American lives and non-American lives. American lives. But what I think is instructive about this story of these 3 Americans who were killed is what it says about us as a society. Because I think that if you reach a point where a state starts to deprive its citizens of just the basic rights to present a defense against themselves and to face their accusers, and if that's the standard that's being used for your own citizens, then what happens when it's a non-US citizen, a Pakistani or a Yemeni or an Iraqi or an Afghan? I think it says a lot about who we are, how we treat the most reprehensible of our people, and what access we give them to court systems. That's how a society is defined. It's not defined by how you treat law-abiding citizens, it's how you treat those that you have a problem with. And it's why they always talk about America being the shining city on the hill, you know? Because we're different than the rest of the world. We have these rights, we have this rule of law, and that's what we hear over and over, and it's a bipartisan talking point. But it's not tested on the good days, it's tested on the bad days, and that's why this story matters. And really, you know, I want to talk about this in reverse, because in late September 2011, President Obama was faced with a decision. His counterterrorism teams from the CIA and the military's Joint Special Operations Command had found the person that Obama had said, I want him. And he was someone that was identified as one of the highest value targets on the US kill list. And it was this man named Anwar al-Awlaki. And the president is presented with information, intelligence, that they have a lock on al-Awlaki's house in northern Yemen. He had been on the run for years, and they finally found him. And President Obama had to make a decision. He had already served as the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury, and he convicted Anwar al-Awlaki, and he sentenced him to death. And now he had to decide whether he was going to implement the death penalty on this U.S. citizen. And Obama didn't hesitate in saying, yes, we want him dead, take him out. Now, many of you probably know who Anwar al-Awlaki is. You probably know him from the YouTube videos and the sort of cartoonish portrayal of him, where the last 3 years of his life are all we know about him, and then he somehow became a terrorist in a vacuum. And then he was sort of born that way, and that's always who he was. You see the video of him in camouflage jacket, with a big beard, in front of a black flag, calling for Muslims around the world to carry out armed attacks in their own countries, in the West, and US and Britain, or to join the fronts of jihad in Afghanistan, or Yemen, or Somalia. But Anwar al-Awlaki's story says a lot about who we are and how far we've come or gone post 9/11. I remember seeing Anwar al-Awlaki on television soon after 9/11. I actually tried to book him for Democracy Now! At the time. And the reason I knew about him was because he was on PBS, and he was on NPR, he was on Talk of the Nation, and he was profiled in the Washington Post for a piece they did about Ramadan. And at the time, Anwar al-Awlaki was the imam at a large religious center, the Dar al-Hijra Mosque in Falls Church, Virginia. And after 9/11, he became a sort of media celebrity, because what he was saying, I think, reflected the feelings of many American Muslims in the US, that there was a condemnation of what had happened on 9/11. And there was a sense that those who were responsible should be brought to justice, but there also was the fact that Muslims were being targeted in hate crimes. And there was this environment of bigotry and hatred that was coming out in both the media and on the streets. The day after 9/11, a Muslim woman stumbled into al-Awlaki's mosque after being beaten with a baseball bat. Muslim organizations were being raided, imams were being pressured by the FBI to start serving as informants. And al-Awlaki was this man who was making sense of that experience and talking about what it was like to be a Muslim in America at that time. In fact, he was considered to be such a serious part of the dialogue in the United States at the time that he was actually invited to attend a luncheon at the Pentagon. They invited him to give a lecture about the state of Islam in the world. And just to give you a sense of how, and he went and he gave that lecture at the Pentagon, give you a sense of how bad the U.S. intelligence was at the time. We know there was a lot of bad intelligence at the time about Iraq, WMDs and other things. Among the sandwiches that they served when al-Awlaki came to speak at the Pentagon was a bacon sandwich. It just shows you how much they really were in tune with the state of Islam in the world today and why they needed to invite Anwar al-Awlaki to speak to them. But al-Awlaki was a guy who didn't grow up aspiring to be the guy in the camouflage jacket. His father was a Fulbright scholar who had come to the United States in 1966. He refined his English staying with an evangelical Christian family in Lawrence, Kansas, and he wrote this essay about what he wanted to get out of his education in the U.S. And he said, I come from a country that doesn't even have a name yet. He was from southern Yemen. And he said that, I view America as this progressive, this great progressive hope in the world. And I want to get an education in the United States, and I want to bring it back to my country, and I want to address the water crisis in my country. And he went to New Mexico State University, and he got his degree in engineering, and then he got a master's degree, and then he got a PhD, and he ended up building up a faculty of agricultural engineering in Yemen and spent his entire life, and he's still working on it to this day, trying to address the water crisis in Yemen. Yemen could be the first country in the world to run out of water. I've got to know that family very well. They are not Anwar al-Awlaki. They are these amazing, wonderful people who tried to raise their children with some spirit of the progressivism that he talked about, or that he interpreted the United States as representing in the world. But when Anwar al-Awlaki was in college during the 1991 Gulf War, he became politicized. I remember it too myself. I remember hearing Bernard Shaw under a desk, reporting on CNN about the bombs falling in Baghdad, and remembering how ridiculous it was that someone named Wolf Blitzer was reporting from the Pentagon. And it was the first time that I was 16 years old when that started. I remember it was the first time that I really came face to face with the reality of U.S. wars. And al-Awlaki's in college in Colorado, and he wasn't a particularly religious guy at all. And he started getting involved with some anti-war organizing. And he was invited to give a speech at a mosque. And the imam at the mosque said, you have a great gift for public speaking, and I think you should come back again and keep talking with us in the community. And Anwar eventually decided that he wanted to become an imam. And so he pursued Islamic scholarship and ended up becoming an imam first in Denver, where his eldest son was born, Abdul Rahman, born in 1995. And then in San Diego, there's these pictures of him with a big beard fishing off the coast. And his wife would make fish and give it to the neighbors. And then they moved to Washington, D.C., and he was the imam at that mosque, and then 9/11 happened, and al-Awlaki became a media celebrity. And then the wars started to spread. And Afghanistan went from being a mission to try to hunt down Osama bin Laden and his network to looking a lot like the Soviet occupation. And then Guantanamo started to make it into the news, and the images of prisoners in orange jumpsuits shackled, and stories of them having diapers placed on them, fed in shakes, and waterboarding and torture. And then the Iraq War began, which, all of us know the story of that, and I spent a tremendous amount of time in Iraq. And then the photos of Abu Ghraib come out, and the stories about secret CIA prisons around the world, and the posturing toward other Muslim countries, and Bush calling it a crusade. And as the U.S. wars started to spread, and the rhetoric intensified from the White House, al-Awlaki's own politics became more radical. His analysis of what the U.S. was doing in the world sharpened. And he decided that he no longer wanted to live in the United States, the country of his birth, and he returned to Yemen and was trying to make sense of his life and what he wanted to do, and he thought about getting involved with real estate, and he started attending classes in Sana, and he was recording sermons. And his sermons became very popular in the English-speaking Muslim diaspora around the world. And the FBI and other intelligence agencies in other countries started noticing that his sermons were popping up in terror plots in various countries. Now, we all know that the FBI has become very good at busting its own terror plots inside of the United States. It's incredibly good at it.
Yeah.
But they started popping up in all of these plots that they were busting up in a number of countries. And so al-Awlaki ends up on the U.S. radar in a very real way. And in 2006, al-Awlaki's in Sana'a, Yemen, attending classes and giving lectures at a local university and mosque when he was arrested by Yemen's secret police, and he's put in prison on trumped-up charges of intervening in a tribal dispute. And al-Awlaki believed that he was put in prison at the request of the U.S. government. And in fact, the FBI came over and they interrogated al-Awlaki when he was in this Yemeni prison. And I reviewed Anwar al-Awlaki's prison writings, and he was given limited access to books, but in some of his writings he reviews Shakespeare's work, and he said he didn't care for Shakespeare. He considered him an imperialist, and he loved Charles Dickens, and compared figures in the U.S. government or Yemeni government to Uriah Heep and other characters. But he believed that the U.S. had put him there, and he spent 18 months in prison, 17 of them in solitary confinement. And what I discovered in my investigation is that he was right. John Negroponte, who at the time was the director of national intelligence and knows quite a bit about early wars from his time in Honduras in the 1980s, where he was a major figure in the funding and arming of the Contras in Nicaragua and defending the human rights abuses of Battalion 316 and other murderous forces in Honduras, that there was a meeting where John Negroponte was with a senior Yemeni official and Bandar Bush, the famed Saudi diplomat, whose nickname is Bandar Bush because of his closeness to the Bush family. And John Negroponte said that it's the position of the U.S. that we want Anwar al-Awlaki kept in prison for 4 to 5 years so that people forget about him. And the Yemeni government protested it and said we can't keep someone without charge in prison. His tribe is not going to stand for this. And the United Nations had investigated his imprisonment and said that it was extra legal. And they held him as long as they could, and then they had to release him because they had serious problems with the tribes. And the tribes are in control of a lot in Yemen. So they put al-Awlaki back out on the street. And al-Awlaki starts a website called Imam Anwar's Blog, and the internet becomes his mosque. And he has a vibrant comment section, and he's in some cases doing mundane things like answering questions about is it acceptable to eat cheese if it's purchased from a big box grocery store, for Muslims to eat cheese that's purchased in a big box grocery store, to answering questions about is suicide bombing permissible under the Quran. And you see him really starting to become more and more accepting of the reality that, or what he perceived as reality, that the United States was at war against Islam, and he was starting to call on people to fight against the United States. And he's all the while being harassed by Yemen's intelligence services. The American government is putting tremendous pressure on Yemen to put him back in prison. And al-Awlaki decides that he's going to leave the capital of Yemen and go to their tribal area where he feels that he can hide out from the authorities. And so he leaves his family. At that point he had 3 children. He leaves his 3 children and his wife behind with his parents in Sana'a, and he moves down to Scahill. And while he's down there, the head of Yemen's intelligence service comes to Dr. Nasser al-Awlaki, his father, who's this prominent Yemeni who had been the minister of agriculture in Yemen. And they say to him, if you don't convince Anwar to come back and go back into our prison, the Americans are going to kill him with a drone. This is before Nidal Hassan committed the massacre at Fort Hood. This is before the underwear bomb plot happened. This is before Anwar al-Awlaki became any kind of story in the U.S. This is in May of 2009. So Dr. Nasser al-Awlaki goes down to Scahill with his wife, and they meet with their son, Anwar. And they say, the Americans say they're going to kill you if you don't come back to Sana'a. They try to convince him to come back. And they had an interaction where Anwar basically said to his father, are you working for the Americans? I'm not going to let the Americans tell me which way to position my bed at night. I was born free, I'm going to die free. And that was the last time that his father spoke to him. So he goes back to Yemen, and from that moment on, Anwar al-Awlaki was living his life underground. When Major Nidal Hassan opened fire on his fellow soldiers in Fort Hood, Texas, and killed more than a dozen and wounded many others, he was paralyzed himself in that operation, al-Awlaki's name emerged again in the media. It was really the first time I think many Americans had heard of him, and there were these reports that Anwar al-Awlaki had been in email contact with Nidal Hassan. And to this day, the story persists that al-Awlaki was involved with the Fort Hood shooting. He had indeed been in touch by email with Nidal Hassan, but those emails have now been released, and U.S. intelligence looked at them and determined that al-Awlaki had nothing to do with it. If you read the emails, it's basically like Nidal Hassan was stalking him. He was sending him emails asking him to help him find a wife in Yemen, saying, I want to give you a prize, a $5,000 prize. And al-Awlaki responded only to a couple of them and said, no, give it to orphans. And then he said, I want to have an essay contest in your name for who could write the best essay about Imam Anwar al-Awlaki, and he was just kind of like, yeah. And then Nidal Hasan commits this massacre. And it's interesting because it's sort of portrayed as just Nidal Hasan was a terrorist, and of course it's a horrifying thing that happened. And in fact, a colleague of my mom's, her husband was killed in that shooting. And it was terrible. But the thing is, Nidal Hasan also is a complicated guy. He was an army psychiatrist who was listening to the stories of U.S. soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and he had actually tried, within his chain of command, to get some of his fellow soldiers prosecuted for what he considered were war crimes. And eventually he took matters into his own hands and he shot all of these fellow soldiers, and he said he did it because he wanted to prevent them from going and killing in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm certainly not defending what he did, but I think it's important that we understand the motivation for people. If we want to have any progress, we have to understand why these events happened. Why does 9/11 happen? Why did the Boston Marathon bombing happen? And we have to understand the motivation in order to move forward. So this happens, and then al-Awlaki really sealed his fate, because the day after Nidal Hasan did this, al-Awlaki wrote a blog post that was titled "Nidal Hasan is a Hero." And he called on other Muslims in the US military to do the same actions as Nidal Hasan. And the CIA then shut down his blog. It was the last blog post that Anwar al-Awlaki ever posted. And then a month later, when this deranged young Nigerian guy, Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, tried to set his underpants on fire and blow up the airplane over Detroit, it emerged that al-Awlaki had met with him, had been in touch with him in Yemen. And al-Awlaki denied that he had any operational role in it, but he acknowledged that he knew Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib. Now, I don't know the facts of it. I don't know what al-Awlaki's role was, if any, in that. He may have been everything that the U.S. government says. He may have directed that plot. He may have issued a fatwa. He may have directed him to do it. But that evidence was never presented publicly in a court. There was never an indictment against Anwar al-Awlaki for being behind or involved with the Christmas Day bombing. And to me, this is what matters about this story. It's not so much about who Anwar al-Awlaki was. I'm willing to concede anything they want, that he, in terms of him being involved with plots or criminal activity. But if that's true, then you should be able to put forward evidence to show that that was the case and issue an indictment and demand his extradition. And if you can't bring him to justice that way, then you look at other options. But none of that ever happened. And so in December of 2009 was the first time that I'm aware of that the U.S. government tried to kill Anwar al-Awlaki in a missile strike at the very end of the year. And in fact, Yemen had said that he had been killed, which was false. And for the next 2.5 years, the U.S. tried to kill Anwar al-Awlaki more than a dozen times. At one point, a guy named Morton Storm, who was a Danish, he was a former biker gang guy, a Danish guy, who had a long criminal record, had sort of converted to Islam and had met Anwar al-Awlaki in the early 2000s in Yemen. And he saw that the U.S. was trying to hunt down and kill Anwar al-Awlaki, and he went to the Danish intelligence service, the PET, and he said, I can help you find Anwar al-Awlaki. I'm still in email touch with him. So then the Danish intelligence service contacts the CIA, and the CIA comes over and they meet with Morton Storm. And they concoct a plot, Danish intelligence, CIA, Morton Storm, to try to find Anwar al-Awlaki a wife to join him underground. And so Morton Storm starts communicating in encrypted emails with Anwar al-Awlaki, and then they put an ad on Facebook for a wife who wants to marry Anwar al-Awlaki. And many women respond to the call on al-Awlaki's Facebook page. And al-Awlaki begins exchanging videos with a young woman from Croatia who was a Catholic that had converted to Islam named Amina. And eventually al-Awlaki and Amina decide that they're going to marry. Neither of them have any idea that Morton Storm was working for the CIA. The CIA paid him $250,000 for working with them. And so the CIA purchases or provides luggage that's going to be given by Morton Storm to Amina as a gift. And they had tracking devices in the luggage. And the plan was for her to go to Yemen and meet up with Anwar al-Awlaki, who she thinks she's going to be marrying, and then they're going to kill both of them in a drone strike. Which is, if you think about it, so she had no idea that this is how she was being used. I mean, there's so many questions that we should be asking about those kinds of actions. But she lands in Sama, though, and al-Awlaki's people go to pick her up at the airport, and they ditch the luggage, and they make her change clothes, and they leave the luggage behind, and she goes off and actually marries Anwar al-Awlaki, and a baby with him. So this, I call that the CIA's dating service. You know, that's the only funny part of the book. I'm sorry to disappoint. Jay Leno type stuff. Well, he's actually not that fun. But they also at one point tried to pay Anwar al-Awlaki's youngest brother Ammar $5 million to give up his location. He worked for an oil company in Austria, and they approached him in a hotel and basically said, you know, there's a $5 million reward, and that money would go a long way for raising Anwar's children. So Osama bin Laden gets killed, you know, in May of 2011, and you know, if people want to talk about this in the Q&A, I'm happy to. But the one thing I'll say about the bin Laden raid is I don't believe there was ever an actual intent to capture Osama bin Laden. I think that was an assassination mission. And I believe that the Pentagon lawyers gave the go-ahead to the Navy SEALs to assassinate Osama bin Laden when they were training in Arizona. They trained at 2 sites in Arizona and in North Carolina. A Pentagon lawyer had come down to observe the Navy SEALs, and they asked him, is this a kill-only operation? And he said, no, this isn't an assassination. If he's lying naked on the floor, don't kill him. Which is basically, that's not going to happen. They're going to the guy's bed in the middle of the night, bedroom in the middle of the night, and bumping him off. So after the Osama bin Laden hit, I think the Obama administration wanted to try to run the deck, and they had located al-Awlaki in May of 2011, and he was in Shebla, where he had been moving around, and they did an operation where they tried to blow him up with a drone strike, and the drone misfired and missed al-Awlaki's vehicle as he was driving in his truck. And al-Awlaki and his cohorts didn't know that it was a drone. They thought maybe they were being ambushed, so they were trying to do some evasive maneuvers, and a drone comes around, fires another missile, misses again, causes this big dust up in the desert, and al-Awlaki was able to call for backup. So these 2 brothers, the Harad brothers, come to try to bail out al-Awlaki, and they're in this smoke storm, and they drive their vehicle in, and they switch vehicles with al-Awlaki, and it's like something out of a movie, and they drive in opposite directions, and the CIA planners had only 1 missile left, so they had to choose which car to go for, and they went for the original one that al-Awlaki was in, and they blow it up, killing the 2 brothers that were in it, and al-Awlaki watched the drone strike on his own vehicle from a nearby cliff. And he wrote an essay about that night, and he said that, according to him, 11 missiles missed their target, but the next one might hit. And so that brings us back to how I started with, so we make it to September of 2011. So the Obama administration has located al-Awlaki. He's actually not in Shebwa anymore. He's in the north of Yemen, which was interesting because he was outside of his tribal area. And al-Awlaki was with another young American named Samir Khan, who's a Pakistani-American from North Carolina. And I got to know Samir Khan's mother, Sarah, and she told me that the FBI repeatedly came to visit with them when they knew that Samir was in Yemen, and they said, he's not charged with any crimes, and there was a grand jury that never returned an indictment against him. He was a propagandist, basically, that was believed to be the editor-in-chief of Inspire magazine, the magazine of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And so these 2 are in this house, and the U.S. war planners are watching them. And while this is going on, Anwar al-Awlaki's son, Abdul Rahman, who was this kid who was born in Colorado in 1995, hadn't seen his father for years. And he had just turned 16. And felt that he was old enough now to try to go and find his father. And I got to know this family very, very well. This kid had nothing to do with terrorism, not even close. You talk to everyone that knew him, his friends, his family members, his siblings. And they all described this wonderful, quiet, funny kid who was into comic books and hip-hop music, and he would hang out in Change Square with the nonviolent revolutionaries that were trying to bring down the U.S.-backed dictatorship of Ali Abdullah Saleh during the period that's referred to as the Arab Spring. But he was a kid who missed his father and had a totally different memory of who his dad was, because the last time he saw him, he wasn't the most wanted man in the world at that point. So he runs away from home one morning. He goes into his mother's purse and he steals the equivalent of about $40 in Yemeni reals. And he packs a small bag, he climbs out the kitchen window of his family's house, and he goes to the bus station in Bab el-Yemen in the old city in Sana. And he gets on a bus and he goes to Shebwa, where he thinks his father is, in this scene of repeated drone strikes and attempting to kill his dad. And soon after he arrives there, he's staying with family, with their family from their tribe. The news comes that his father's been killed. And when Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan were killed, there were basically 2 reactions in Washington: silence or celebration. Hillary Clinton sounded just like John McCain. One Republican congressman said, well, if Samir Khan wasn't a target, then it was a bonus. It was a twofer. The only people that raised any objections about it in Capitol Hill or thought that this was significant at all, the president assassinating U.S. citizens who hadn't been charged with a crime and weren't on a battlefield shooting at U.S. troops, were predictable: Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul. They were the only two political figures that said anything about this publicly. Most of it was pure celebration. President Obama, in announcing that Anwar al-Awlaki had been killed, didn't say we killed Anwar al-Awlaki. He announced that it was a great victory that he had been killed. And then he bestowed upon him a title that had never before been used in describing al-Awlaki. He called him the head of external operations for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. I haven't met anyone in Yemen or elsewhere that ever heard about that with Anwar al-Awlaki. If al-Awlaki had any role within Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, he wasn't even middle management. This was a guy who was totally insignificant to everyone in Yemen, and he was frightening to the US because he spoke English, but he was a nobody in Yemen. Most Yemenis had never even heard of Anwar al-Awlaki. Now, I don't know, as I said at the beginning, what al-Awlaki was involved with. He may have been involved with all sorts of nefarious activities. He certainly said things I found reprehensible, some of them despicable, potentially criminal things he was involved with. He called for the assassination of a young cartoonist in Seattle, Washington, named Molly Morris, because of the controversy over drawing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. They published a hit list, and al-Awlaki said that people should go and kill this young woman, and she had to go underground and into an FBI relocation program and change her name. So there's not a celebration of who he was, but the fact that he was killed in this manner without having any evidence against him should be of concern to all of us. So al-Awlaki is killed, Samir Khan is killed, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki is now in Shebwa, and his father has been killed, and his grandmother calls him and says, Abdul Rahman, it's over, you have to come home, back to Sana'a, your father is dead, and you have to come back. And she told me that Abdul Rahman said, I'm come back in a couple of days, but I have to wait for the roads to clear. Because at that time there was tremendous fighting in the south of Yemen, the revolution was happening, but there also was fighting between rebel factions and the government forces of Yemen. And he wasn't able to get back on a bus because the roads were shut down, so he had to wait in Shebwa with his extended family members. And one night, about 2 weeks after his father was killed, October 14th, 2011, he's in an outdoor restaurant with his cousin Ahmed, who is 17 years old, and a group of other young people from their tribe, when a drone appeared in the sky above them and fired a Hellfire missile at them and blew them up. And the next day, Nasser al-Awlaki, his grandfather, who was raising him, and had plans to send him back to the United States for college, and had told me that we wanted a different life for Abdul Rahman than his father chose. We wanted to put him on a different path, and they were trying to shelter him from all of this. He said that when the family members called them and told them that Abdul Rahman had been killed, they said, we really couldn't identify any of the body parts, so we had to bury them in a mass grave, but we know it was Abdul Rahman because we found part of his head, and it had this flowing hair on it. And I encourage people to look at pictures of this kid. He had this huge sort of afro, and his grandfather and his grandmother and his mother were always telling him that they wanted him to cut it, but he had sort of staked that out as his rebellious teenage statement, that he loved his hair that way. So they knew that was him because of the part of his skull with his hair on it. And the family felt there's no way this could be possible. That you kill our son and then you kill our grandson. This can't be a coincidence. And they wanted to know why it was that this 16-year-old kid had been killed in a drone strike in an area where there had never been U.S. drone strikes before. And then the media reports start coming out about it, saying that Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki's son had been killed, and a U.S. military official leaked the idea that he was actually 21 years old. Then the family presented the birth certificate from the state of Colorado showing that he had just turned 16 years old. And then they said, well, he was at an Al-Qaeda meeting. He was meeting with Al-Qaeda figures, but they could never come up with the name of anyone who'd actually been killed in that strike. And then they said, oh, well, he was next to the guy we were trying to kill, Ibrahim al-Bana, who was a propagandist for AQAP. Well, it turns out that Ibrahim al-Bana is still alive. So why was this kid killed? What's the answer to that question? Harry Reid was on CNN soon after the strike, and Candy Crowley asked him about the killing of Samir Khan and Anwar al-Awlaki and Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, and she mentioned all three of them. And Harry Reid's answer was, well, I can't talk about the details because it's classified, but if there were 3 Americans that deserved to be killed, it was those 3 Americans. And so I went after Harry Reid, and I was trying to get Harry Reid to answer the question. What did Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki do? What was he guilty of? You said he deserved to die. What did he do that made him worthy of death? And they wouldn't answer me at all. And I went after them on Twitter, and they wouldn't respond to me at all. They never explained that statement. And then a young reporter named Sierra Adamson asked Robert Gibbs, who's the former White House press secretary, And at the time, he was the chief surrogate for the Obama re-election campaign in 2012. She went up to him and she said, this was a 16-year-old American citizen who was never charged with a crime. He was killed in this drone strike, and she asked why the administration killed him. And Robert Gibbs' answer was, he should have had a more responsible father. It's an utterly shameful statement. There are a few things I can think of in human history that are more reprehensible than blaming the killing of a child on who their parents are or were. And if that's the actual position of the government, then I weep for the state of affairs in this country, where the former White House press secretary, someone who certainly understands the implications of words, would say to someone that the reason that someone is dead is because they should have had a more responsible father. He was saying, no, he shouldn't be having his children with him. He didn't have his child with him. He had done the right thing and left his family behind with his parents, who he knew were going to raise them in a different way than he ended up in life. And so I've spent months and months pushing on this and trying to get a sense of why they killed Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. And I don't hang out with powerful officials. I don't get invited to the super soaker parties at Joe Biden's house with Chuck Todd and the gang. I don't go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner and laugh at the president's awful jokes about drones. I'm not interested in being a part of those people. But I did recently run into a former senior administration official, and I chased him across a parking lot. And this was someone who was deeply involved with the kill program and was in the administration at the time of the Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki killing. And I asked him about that. He said when President Obama was briefed on that operation before it happened, they told him that it was just this one terrorist. Every time Obama was there by himself, they didn't mention anything about al-Awlaki's kid. And he said the president was very upset when this happened, and that John Brennan, who at the time was the senior advisor on counterterrorism and homeland security, that John Brennan believed it was an intentional hit against al-Awlaki's son. And he ordered a review demanding that the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command provide an explanation. And I asked the former official, what came of the review? And he said, I don't know. And then when I tried to talk to the White House and the National Security Council about it, they said they wouldn't comment on any reviews, and then they emailed me a boilerplate statement about drones. But then this official assured me that it's all just a mistake, that it was collateral damage, and that there's nothing to see here. And I said, well, if that's true, if it was collateral damage, and you killed someone who was this dangerous terrorist, why not just own that and say, this kid was with these people, and these were the people that we killed, this is why we killed them, and it was collateral damage. You know, if that's your position, I think it's a reprehensible position, but why not just own it and say that? The most transparent administration in history, as they call themselves. So he says to me, look, you can read the exact quote, but this is pretty much what it was. It's in a recent piece I published in The Nation. He said, look, we had just killed 3 U.S. citizens in a 2-week period, 2 of whom weren't even targets, Samir Khan and Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. It didn't look good, it was embarrassing. So the final word on this that we have right now is the reason they won't explain why they killed this kid is because it would have been embarrassing to come forward and say it. You know, after Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki was killed, his grandfather filed a lawsuit trying to get an answer as to why the Obama administration killed not only Abdul Rahman, but all 3 of those people. And the Obama administration has used the state secrets privilege to try to prevent any disclosure of those operations or the details of those operations. In fact, when they originally filed a lawsuit before Anwar al-Awlaki was killed, Leon Panetta, who was the CIA director, James Clapper, who was the director of national intelligence, and Robert Gates, who was the defense secretary, all submitted briefs to the court. And in their briefs, we have them, in their briefs they said that we have overwhelming evidence that Anwar al-Awlaki is involved in plots against the United States, but to reveal that would threaten U.S. national security, that the evidence itself was too dangerous to be made public. If you remember that speech that President Obama gave at the National Security Archives very early on in his first term, he said we're going to end the use of the state secrets privilege. He talked about how we're going to shut down the secret prisons. We're going to close Guantanamo. We're going to turn a page from the Bush era. The only page that they've turned is the page that would have called for accountability for the torturers and the people that did all of these horrid actions around the world in secret sites in Poland and Thailand and elsewhere. For all practical purposes, all of that has continued. It's just that it's been rebranded or tweaked a little bit. Instead of the CIA rendering people, we order other governments to render them. Instead of having the CIA running secret prisons, we use a gulag buried in the basement of the Somali National Security Service. Now, I know journalists who have been locked up in that prison. I saw the U.S. Counterterrorism base that was recently built at the Aden Ade Airport in Mogadishu. We're living in a moment where, because there's a popular Democratic president who's a constitutional law professor by trade and won the Nobel Peace Prize, that because he has been in office, these policies are certain to continue. The groundwork has been laid for this to become, once again, a permanent fixture of how the U.S. wages its wars. It's not that we haven't been in this kind of a period before in history. It's that everyone tried to talk about how we're turning the page on it. We are returning to an era where the CIA is a full-blown paramilitary organization, where forces within the Department of Defense, elite teams that report directly to the White House, are given unprecedented authorities to strike in countries where there's no declaration of war. You know that the Obama administration uses as its justification for bombing Yemen the authorization for the use of military force that was passed after 9/11. There was only one member of Congress who voted against the AUMF, and that was Congressman Scahill. And I talk about that moment because I wonder, and I wonder what it was like to be Barbara Lee at that moment in the U.S. Congress. If you watch the video of her speech, she's trembling. Remember the hysteria in our society at that moment. Imagine what it took, the courage it took to stand up and be the one person who's going to say, we don't want a state of perpetual war at a time when there is just this epic state of calls for revenge and strikes against multiple countries. And she stood up and she did it. If you read that speech, she correctly predicted what was going to happen. She talked about the consequences to the moral character of our society if we allow these wars to be our response to something that should be handled like a crime and not as a war. If we don't demilitarize our approach to combating terrorism and treat it as a crime again, then there's no way that these wars end. How do you fight against an idea or destroy an idea when every drone strike that you do is creating a whole new generation of enemies? We are killing more innocent people than we are so-called terrorists. We are making more new enemies than we are killing the bad guys, as they like to call them. One of the most egregious policies that the Obama administration has expanded is this thing called signature strikes, which started in Pakistan and now happen in Yemen. Signature strikes are a grotesque form of pre-crime, where there are individuals that, because they're quote-unquote military-age males in a particular region of Pakistan or Yemen, someone in their group may have been in contact with someone the U.S. believes is a terrorist. The U.S. government preemptively, the counterterrorism team preemptively declares them to be terrorists, and that justifies a strike against them. We don't even have the identities of these people that we are intentionally targeting. We don't have actual evidence in some cases that they're involved with any plots against the United States. We are presuming that one day they may, in fact, become terrorists, and therefore we're going to kill them. You don't think that that has something to do with the fact that Obama has the embarrassment of Guantanamo still being open? He doesn't want to capture people and put them in Guantanamo. Every time he tries to prosecute someone in the civilian system in the United States, the Republicans go bananas and say that these people should be treated as enemy combatants, as they have with this Sarnaev kid in Boston. They wanted him sent to Guantanamo. So the capture-kill program has basically just become the kill program. You don't want to stick these people in Guantanamo because it would be politically embarrassing, and you don't want to give them access to the court system in the United States because it causes political problems for you. And so you just start to say, well, we're going to preemptively knock these people off in Yemen or Somalia or elsewhere. We have warlords on our payroll in Somalia. We continue to use mercenaries from whatever Blackwater's current iteration is, Academy, I think it's called now. Eric Prince was recently at the Tribeca Film Festival, walking the red carpet. There's a film made about him and his efforts to counter piracy, as it's put in Somalia. We continue to use secret prisons. We continue extraordinary renditions. We continue to snatch people around the world and put them in the gulags of foreign governments. And you know, I watched the Boston Marathon bombing coverage, I'm sure all of you did, and I thought some of it was so racist and bigoted, and just this hysteria whipped up, and what they did to that kid, the track runner, Rupert Murdoch, put his picture on the cover of the New York Post. You remember this? He put his picture on there and said, these are the guys, the bagmen, these are the guys that the feds are looking for. It's this kid dressed up like he's a track runner. And you know, it's amazing, and it's really stunning that a kid dressed in a tracksuit who is a track star at his high school would actually want to go to the Boston Marathon. But because he happened to be a kid in a tracksuit at the Boston Marathon who had dark brown skin, he somehow becomes suspect number one in the eyes of King Rupert Murdoch. And his life is, you know, he's tarred and smeared and sent through the mud. But there was some great media coverage too of the aftermath of the Boston bombing. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Carlos Arredondo, you know, whose son was killed in Iraq and is this sort of heroic activist. And you saw, if you don't know who he is, then I'm sure you've seen a picture of him. He's the guy in the cowboy hat who's carrying away the double amputee who had his legs blown off. And Carlos Arredondo ran toward the blast instead of away from it, and he was heroic in trying to save lives there. And we all know the story of the 8-year-old kid, you know, who had that beautiful picture that went around Facebook where he drew the peace sign. And, you know, his family members have been in the media describing who he was and what a special kid he was. And President Obama talked about the Chinese woman who was a graduate student who was one of the victims killed. And I was recently in Boston with a friend who's from China, and she told me that after the president said the name of this woman from China, that a blog post went viral in China, and the title of it was "Where You Die Matters." And the point of the piece was that the most powerful man in the world never would have said the name of this Chinese woman if she had died in a factory making a product for American consumers, but because she died in Boston. And there was something that really struck me about that, because you know, if you see the film that we made, or you look in the book at the picture section, there are a couple of young Yemeni girls that I have pictures of in there, and one of them was this little girl that I met when I went to Abyan province in Yemen, and she was a survivor of the first missile strike that Obama authorized against Yemen, and it was December 17, 2009. The U.S. started bombing Yemen, and they launched cruise missiles at this Bedouin village called Al-Majla. And they killed 46 people, and they used cluster bombs and cruise missiles fired from submarines. And there were 14 women and 21 children killed in that attack. And Yemen took responsibility for it. And because of the WikiLeaks cables, we know that it was a U.S. strike. Because General David Petraeus is in those cables conspiring with the leaders of Yemen to start bombing their country and having Yemen take responsibility for it. And they claim that it was a Yemeni attack on an Al-Qaeda base. But when we actually investigated who was killed, the overwhelming majority of the people that were killed there that day were women and children. And cluster bombs are a horrid weapon. I saw them used in Yugoslavia, and they're banned under international conventions, and the U.S. continues to use them. They shred human beings into meat. And I met this little girl whose family members had been killed, and I put the picture of her in the book because if you were to blow that picture up and look at it, in her eyes, you actually can see me looking at her, and you can see Richard Raleigh, the director of our film, filming her. And that picture has stuck with me, and it's haunted me, because to me it says something about who we are to them. How must I look to her when she knows that I'm from the country? I'm the only American that she's ever met. When she knows that I'm from the country that took her family away. And she's staring at me. If you look at that picture in the middle of the book, her eyes are so intense and so adult and so chillingly wise, it seems, and in the reflection of her eyes are the only Americans that she ever met and probably will ever meet. Now, I always make it a point when I go to these countries, and I don't care what people say about objective journalism or whatever, it's a total myth. I always say to people, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what we did to you. Because I believe that that's if I'm the only person they're going to meet from the United States, and I want that person to be the one that says that we're sorry for what we did. And you know, and I think about that in the context of what I was mentioning about the Boston Marathon bombing. What if all of us, and I'm sure there are people in this room that do this every day of their lives, what if all of us made real the story of one person who was killed in one of these operations or who lost their family in these operations, then you're not talking about terms like collateral damage, and you're not saying, well, you know, I understand that women and children were killed, but that happens in war. That's not going to become an acceptable part of the dialogue if you're talking about someone that you identify with or whose story that you know. That's why when incidents like Sandy Hook and Newtown happened, the Boston Marathon bombing happened, all of us feel a sense of just horror and empathy. We look at it and say, look, remember the New York Times cover after the Sandy Hook shooting where you saw the names of all of these kids and and the ages of them. You know, in Newtown where it was 6 years old, 7 years old, 5 years old. I mean, it's horrifying. And the reason that we care about it, why most people care about it, is that you empathize. And you say, oh, that could have been our kids, or that could have been our community. If we don't have the courage, especially when a Democrat is in office, to stand on our principles, to say that I'm going to be the same person under a Republican that I'm going to be under a Democrat, that I actually believe in this because it's a principle and not a partisan game, that I'm not going to cede my conscience to a politician, that I'm not going to act as though American lives are worth more than anyone else's lives around the world. If you're not willing to take that stand, then none of this is ever going to change. And that's why media outlets like KPFA are so important, because you get the voices of people that live on the other side of the barrel of the gun. You know, a colleague of mine in Yemen, Abdullah Shaya, is in prison because President Obama wants him there. He was arrested after exposing that U.S. cruise missile attack I talked to you about, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for being an al-Qaeda facilitator. And when Yemen's president wanted to pardon him, word leaked in the media, and President Obama called Yemen's president and said the U.S. is concerned about reports you're going to release him, and the pardon was ripped up, and he remains locked up to this day. And I heard that last week that the new Yemeni president, Hadi, is issuing an order to release him. And I hope that President Obama doesn't pick up the phone again and cause this Yemeni journalist to remain in prison. But we're living at a time when whistleblowers are being prosecuted under the Espionage Act. It sent a chill through the community, where the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, is flirting with the notion of indefinite detention of U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. When we have a corporatization of media and an infotainment culture where the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills are called reality television and the Real Widows of Baghdad are a story that doesn't even make it onto the news anymore if it ever did in the United States. We need outlets like KPFA to tell those stories, and that's why I'm honored to be with all of you tonight, because I want to say I'm proud to be a part of the Pacifica Radio family. Thank you very much.